That's Debatable is sponsored by MB&G. MB&G is specialists in the esoteric world of vehicle and furniture warranty insurance, delivering quite marvellous customer service, prompt claims payment, and a highly developed understanding of how to deliver these products in a way that is both compliant with the regulations and attractive to customers. To find out more, call Paul Smith, the Managing Director, on 07887 501 441. That's 07887 501 441. Hello and welcome to That's Debatable, the weekly news podcast of the Free Speech Union. Welcome back to all of our listeners and welcome back to all of our viewers. And welcome back to you, Jan. It's you again with me on the podcast, and you've got some news from the trenches already, haven't you?
Yes. Good morning, Tom.
Morning.
Nice way to start the week. So yes, so Saturday afternoon I was at the AFAF conference, and that's the Academics for Academic Freedom organisation, and they had a conference on Saturday afternoon in London, which was a national conference. I think it's the second time they've done a national one. So this is an organisation that actually predates the Free Speech Union. So it's been going since 2006, set up by Professor Dennis Hayes, who's a professor of education at the University of Derby, long-standing trade union campaigner and a free speech campaigner. And he set up AFAF a number of years ago to really restate the case for academic freedom at a time when it was starting to become obvious that the commitment to it was ebbing away. So he founded it with a statement, a very kind of blunt statement in defence of academic freedom, which now has 1,500 signatories. It's kind of accumulated signatories over the years by academics. And then in 2022, they started setting up branches around the country. And so it's a really good, it feels like a bit belt and braces really when it comes to free speech, because while Free Speech Union can offer casework and that kind of a reach across lots of different areas of life, AFAF has got this very focused attention on academia, but it covers both students and academics. So at the conference on Saturday, there was about 50, 60 people, all of whom are kind of active in the branches around the country. And they've got branches in, just some of them are Birmingham, Buckingham, Cardiff, Canterbury, Leeds, Derby, Nottingham, City University, Dublin, and there's a lot more now. And I think they're really springing up in the last year, which is a really good sign, I think, that the academics feel compelled now to make themselves public in defending academic freedom. I think for far too long, they were either not noticing or not acknowledging that there was a problem, hoping it would kind of go away, or just being so scared that they felt like they were the only person. Whereas now what's happened with both the Free Speech Union and with AFAF, I think, is people are kind of finding each other and becoming a lot bolder in speaking out. And obviously there's also these very high profile cases of academics who have won against universities and colleagues. So Professor Jo Phoenix was there, who won against the Open University for hounding her out of her academic position. Dr. Neil Finn, who was a lecturer at Edinburgh University, who's one of our very early academic cases, actually, who challenged very gently critical race theory and some of the kind of new racialization of academic life that was going on. He was subsequently investigated and subject to a kind of disciplinary process, really, really terrible. He's now retired and looks much happier for it, I have to say. It was really nice to see him.
Retirement seems to be the ultimate escape from cancel culture, doesn't it, Jan?
As people are approaching it, they seem to be free to sort of just say, right, if I don't say it now, I'm never going to say it. And then also Shireen Benjamin, who's on our Scottish Advisory Council, who set up a very successful Edinburgh branch of AFAF and is just very bold and really very supportive of lots of other academics. And students as well. Got a student branch, national branch, which is very encouraging.
I love the quote that jumped out at me from the notes that we've got in front of us, Jan, that you put together for this item. Asking an academic if they are for academic freedom ought to be like asking an astronaut if they are for space travel. You know, that reminds me of what Tom Holland talks about when the historian, when he talks about culture. and he talks particularly about Christianity. He says it's the water in which we swim. So we don't notice it because it's the waters we swim in. And it ought to be that academic freedom is like that. It's the waters in which you swim if you're an academic at university, because it's a given. It's the very essence of what you're doing as an academic, which is exploring the unknown and pushing the boundaries and asking the unthinkable. I mean, this is all so, it should be so natural.
Yes.
And yet this is so needed. But it sounds like it was a very, very good, good conference indeed.
Well, just one little extra thing, which is one of the students who spoke made a really eye-opening observation, which was that she said that almost the worst thing that she witnesses as a student is these situations where in a lecture hall she can feel the academic holding back because they don't want to upset students. And she says she can feel them kind of not asking the question or not pursuing an idea that might be considered to be more controversial.
Wow.
And she said that's really disturbing, because if they do it, then that means all the other students have to do it as well. The students who might want to explore those questions are also silenced. So there was a real kind of call from the students for leadership from academics, which I think is really, really important. It's been sorely lacking.
Very encouraging. Very encouraging. Well, that's good news. But we have more good news as well, which is that during the week since we recorded last week, the case of Essex police investigating Allison Pearson has been dropped. So that was all over the newspaper and all over the television over the last few days, and is an important update on this whole area of thought crime and police spending more time seemingly investigating what people say online than they do investigate what's going on the streets. But two things that we wanted just briefly now to talk about was the first, that despite all of this, Yvette Cooper is still planning to expand non-crime hate instance. So she's committed to reversing the Tories' decision to downgrade the monitoring of non-crime hate instance, or NCHI, as we can now call them, specifically in relation to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, so that they can continue to be logged by the police. And according to the Home Secretary, so Labour believes the current guidance prevents officers from tracking tensions involving Jewish and Muslim communities that could escalate into violence and criminality. And so, this is troubling, because after all of the kerfuffle, and including voices in the government actually saying, yes, this is ridiculous, what's happening with the non-crime hate instance generally, and what was discovered last week, children and all sorts of people in communities being reported for very, very trivial things. Even in the government, they were saying, yeah, this makes no sense. And yet, Yvette Cooper is still wanting to push this through. And a Home Office source said, it is part of our manifesto commitment, so we will work with the College of Policing to understand the best way of doing that, so police can assess where there is a high instance of anti-Semitic and Islamophobic hate crime. So it does seem that that we are not yet going to be able to say goodbye to these NCHIs. Now, another last point I would make on this is that we, the Free Speech Union, we are threatening to take legal action against the Home Office if it goes ahead with plans to unpick the rules laid down by Suella Braverman. So this is the code of conduct that we spoke briefly about last week, laid down by Suella Braverman, that was rolled out and came into force, was approved by the College of Police and came into force in June last year, and has a lot of good things in it that we talked about. Not children should generally not get NCHIs. Generally, when NCHIs are recording personal data, not always, there are exceptions, generally the person should be told about those. So there are some good things in that code. And we would challenge Yvette Cooper and the Home Office if they decided to sort of roll that back, because that we felt was a good step forward in a world where we still have to live with the NCHI. And we'll come on to the next point on that in a bit. But in a world where we still have to live with the NCHI, that code of conduct did seem like a good step in the right direction. I mean, I don't know what you felt about the news cycle this week, Jan, on the whole area of non-crime hate instance. The snowball really hasn't stopped, has it?
Yeah, which is great. I mean, I think the momentum has to keep building, and there has to be a kind of pressure to really examine this and scrap it. Really, I mean, I'm not, and I was really pleased for Allison Pearson. I thought that was a good ad, but that's good for everybody. So if the case against her is dropped, that's good for everybody. Still some mealy mouthed commentary going on about this. People trying to kind of, on the one hand say, well, obviously she shouldn't have had a knock on the door, but on the other hand, it's just a good thing if people don't get investigated by the police for something that they say. That's just a good thing.
Yeah.
So I think we have to welcome it. But one of the things that jumps out actually about what the government is doing at the moment, and I'm very worried by this, which is they're kind of censoring in the name of Jewish and Muslim communities. And I find this really worrying because I think people already, the kind of anti-Semitic thinking is that Jews are silencing others. That's already one of the tropes of kind of contemporary anti-Semitism. This idea that the kind of Zionists are in control and they're silencing things. So I think it's very dangerous because it plays into a lot of those kind of new prejudices or kind of reinvented prejudices. And it was an argument that was used to scrap the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill Act as well, which was that somehow it was Jewish and Muslim students that would be threatened. So I think that's very worrying. And then equally, it's not good for Muslim citizens of this country to be seen as censors, mini censors. It's very, very, very unhelpful. We need to have people being treated as if they're fully part of this community and our democratic society. We need to hold everybody to those standards, and part of that is being able to hear anything and to sort of act as an adult and deal with those ideas. So I think this kind of protectionist, supposedly protectionist measures by government are very, very unhelpful to those minorities.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Jan. Censoring in the name of ...
Yeah,
fill in the
yeah,
gap.
yeah.
And I'm sure that
Because
resonates through free speech
yeah,
history.
because before you know it, people assume that any Muslim is censorious, or that any Jew is censorious, and so I think that's really dangerous because that's not the case. And quite often we meet Muslims who don't want to go down the route that more radical Muslims are going down, which is this kind of much more censorious kind of path.
Yeah.
So yeah.
There's another piece of an important update that actually is news hot off the press today, and we're recording on Monday, the 25th of November. And today, Policy Exchange have published a new report that's entitled "The Non-Crime Hate Incident: A Chilling Distraction from the Public's Priorities on Policing." And obviously, very timely report. And we will put a link to that report in the show notes. But what's really interesting about it is that it's been endorsed by the former Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Lord Hogan Howe, and also Lord Jackson, who's a member of the British Transport Police Authority. And what they've done in this report, Policy Exchange has estimated that police officers were spending up to 60,000 hours a year investigating some 13,000 non-crime hate incidents, and that this is diverting them from fighting actual crime. So they've actually put some stats and some analysis behind this. We have as well. We've got our report that we've done on NCHI's, our report and our work. But it's great to have another authoritative voice, particularly coming from people like Lord Hogan Howe and Lord Jackson, people who've been in the trenches, within the police force. It's really helpful. And another interesting fact I picked up from the reporting, it's been reported in the Telegraph. It said that of the case files examined by the police inspectorate, there was an error rate of 25%. Police forces are opaque and variable in their recording, and effectively, the bobbies on the front line. Are we still allowed to say bobbies, Jan? Or does that going to get me arrested? We used to say bobbies on the beat, didn't we? But confusion over the rules meant officers were taking a risk-averse approach, summed up as, if in doubt, record. So this is a really timely report, actually, I think, that's come out. And in the report, there are 9 recommendations at the end, and I've got them right in front of me now. And the first recommendation, I think, will both be very hopeful that this might come into, well, be very glad if this did happen. It says the government should legislate to abolish in its entirety the recording of non-crime hate incidents by the police. Should the government choose to retain the NCHI regime, they should issue an updated code of practice which leads to a substantial reduction in the number of NCHIs recorded, increasing freedom of expression protections and reducing the distraction of police officers from their core mission of fighting crime. This should include no longer recording any NCHIs which do not contain personal data. No longer recording any NCHIs which do not record. I have to read that again to fully understand what they mean by that. But in essence, that recommendation in the first instance is saying really these should be abolished or absolutely minimized. So I think that's a really good piece of good news, Jan, that report coming out.
Yeah, well, certainly greater clarity and pushing back. I mean, if you're getting that many reports, they become meaningless. I mean, that's the thing about a lot of this phenomenon, isn't it? If you call everything hate, you've no longer been able to really identify what the serious threats are.
Yes.
And there's just a deep problem with NCHIs. I was going back to look at the kind of Macpherson report this morning and the Stephen Lawrence murder, which kind of gave rise to that eventually. And you think, God, that was such an extraordinary route that's being taken, where you had the murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993 handled appallingly, so that nobody was arrested, or so were arrests made, but then no charges were pursued against the four or five people that mobbed him and stabbed him to death on a London street. And then that case then became, which was really about these kind of aberrant individuals who killed him, racist by the looks of things, but it was fairly evident early on that it was a racist attack, and then a kind of random racist attack.
Yeah.
And then very, very poor policing, which failed to pursue the perpetrators. And then eventually, somehow, it stops being about violent racists and stops being about the police, and then it becomes about everybody. So we end up with NCHIs where everybody gets scooped up. So these NCHIs were introduced after the Macpherson report, which investigated the shortcomings of the Stephen Lawrence investigation, but it kind of ended up as this incredibly flabby and all-encompassing understanding of what racism was, which was that it was in the eye of the beholder. So it was a shift to a kind of official, subjective understanding of what racism was. But then also this idea that it was running through every single institution, every single part of life. And it really demonized communities, because the idea was that there were these kind of hotspot communities where racism was taking hold. And that somehow explained how Stephen Lawrence came to be murdered. But of course, you end up with this kind of just general demonization of, at the time, kind of working class communities, but then that's spread now to pretty much everybody is now kind of suspected of racism, which
that's a really interesting observation, Jan. The way that the phrase that came out of the Macpherson report was that the police were institutionally racist. And of course, they then had to look in on themselves, quite rightly, to understand that and do something about it. But then to sort of project that into every group in society, which effectively means across the whole of society, is such a leap, isn't it? It's such a leap, because the horror at that murder came out of that society. You know, most right-thinking people in society at that time in 1993 were horrified by what had happened and by what that report found. And so to project it, to reverse Uno, the whole nation, as it were, is a really unexpected consequence. It just shows the sort of ultimate road that we do get from these good intentions, and that they need to be thought about and audited all the way through as to that the unexpected consequences are not happening. Well, that probably leads on to what you wanted to talk about as well, about this idea of hate in society and the labeling of everything as hate. Jan, is that right? Would it make sense now to move on to your next item?
Yes. So there was a story in the Guardian over the weekend, and that the organisation Hope Not Hate which I know people will have strong feelings about probably, they had reported that they'd been trying to organise events discussing a new book that was out by one of their campaigners. And on the back of a film that they'd also produced in the summer, I think it was, that was supposed to be shown as part of the London Film Festival at the British Film Institute on the South Bank, that had been cancelled following threats made against either the venue or the organisers. And then these later events focusing around a book, it was very difficult for them to find a venue because people were threatening the venues. So they ended up having to meet in clandestine circumstances, which won't surprise very many people who probably listen to this podcast who've had to do very similar things over the last few years because it's been very difficult to have public meetings.
Well, the
about
film
political issues.
Adult Human Female, has been cancelled so many times. I think was it in Edinburgh? There were multiple
That's right.
cancelled, and
Took
also across.
4 or 5 attempts to show it, and including kind of protests outside, the university pulling it, threats being made. So this kind of thing has been going on for a really long time for groups across the political spectrum. And I think there's a kind of, we all tend to be a bit one-sided on these things, and it's very difficult to be consistent. But at the same time, the Hope Not Hate instance does really show the really quite profound inconsistency here, because while I take their word that it's been very difficult to organise these kinds of events and meetings, and maybe these threats are serious and should be taken seriously by the police. And I'm sure if you do prod the properly far right thugs, you are going to end up with threats against you. That's they're brave for doing so insofar as that's what they're doing. But they also do an awful lot of other things, which is, I think, to label things far right that are nothing to do with the far right, and which has meant that we've become very disoriented about what kinds of things should really be part of a democratic debate. So anyway, I watched the film that was due to be shown at the British Film Institute. It's on Channel 4, so I watched that last night, and they kind of go undercover amongst the kind of European and British far right groups. And these really are the far right. They're the people that don't believe that black and white people can ever coexist. They don't believe in intermarriage. They think that there's a hierarchy of intellect between the races. They think that, funnily enough, one of them says, we really need to marry amongst our own. The problem is they can't actually find any women that are willing to get together with them. So there's a bit of a problem.
Do they intersect with the incel group? As
well, there's a little bit, just kind of guys that are very bitter, I think, to be honest. So they're not going to be that appealing to a lot of women. But nevertheless, these guys go undercover and they're filming them in Poland and Estonia. But they're very small, actually. The groups that they're finding are very small, and they're having to go to Estonia and Poland to find any kind of number in the gathering. So, and then, what really stood out was that you can identify hate, and that's probably quite easy. We can all point the finger and say, well, that's hate, that's hateful, we don't like them, they're far right. But actually what they can't offer is any hope, because they will never engage in any argument. So that at no point in the documentary do they actually argue against the arguments that are being made. It's all about going undercover and then exposing, which actually doesn't defeat any of the ideas that these people are putting forward. So I think that's the big problem. And that shows you that the problem with a sort of censorious approach is that you never actually expose the ideas to sunlight and really defeat them by actually arguing against them. So that's what was really struck me as I watched it. And it was a bit kind of pearl clutchy, where I don't know why they're so surprised that there are these very far right people who believe these very far right things. They're kind of these guys have existed for a very long time. You shouldn't really be surprised by it. Nevertheless, it's fair enough to take it seriously, but you then have to actually argue against it. You can't just point the finger and then think that that's enough, that somehow people are then going to ostracize them.
Well, I think consistency is a word that we come back to on this, which is trying to be consistent in our application of the principles of free speech and the principles of free expression. We noticed this after the Trump assassination attempt, which we've spoken about a couple of times before, that there was on the right, immediately after that, an attempt to shut down a lot of people who were mocking that attempt, and there was a band that was shut down, and there was even some people who were fired. And there is this cancel culture on the right, which is just as just silly and ridiculous and anti-freedom as cancel culture as we generally know it on the left. Right, we should move on to talk about the Bar Standards Board. We, again, like all these topics, we often touch on them as they're emerging as issues, and then we continue to monitor them as they go through a process, and then we talk about whatever happens. But this one we mentioned before. The Bar Standards Board is the body that regulates barristers and is currently consulting on a change to its own code of conduct rulebook, which will replace the current duty that's there. And the current duty is to refrain from unlawfully discriminating against any person, which is, pretty, obviously most of our listeners, most of our viewers would be perfectly comfortable with that. But they want to replace it with an equality, diversity, and inclusion duty. And specifically, obligations will be brought into line with the solicitors in England and Wales, who are required to act in a way that encourages equality, diversity, and inclusion. That's a big difference from refraining from unlawfully discriminating to acting in a way that encourages equality, diversity, and inclusion. And it's triggered various criticisms of regulatory overreach. And it's been reported in the Times that those criticisms have ratcheted up several notches, because the chair of the Bar Council, which is a separate organisation, it's the professional body for the 17,500 barristers, has accused the watchdog, i.e. the Bar Standards Board, of proposing amendments that were probably unlawful and subject to challenge. And the council said it was adamantly opposed to the board's main recommendation. I mean, what I find really interesting in this, Jan, is almost the civil war that's broken out within the profession itself, whereby one group, in this case the Bar Council, is very opposed to these changes that another group, the Bar Standards Board, is trying to bring in, which really, I think, highlights that there is a big issue here, and especially with a code. When we did the professional review of the actuarial code, and similar changes were being brought in there, the code applies not only to what you do as a professional, but also to your personal life and the way you conduct yourself. And there is logic to that. If you are going to be a trusted professional in society, you ought to be a trusted professional in the community, or at least a trusted member, an upstanding member of the community. So there is logic underpinning that. But when it becomes politicized and controversial, as EDI is, then it becomes really pernicious. That it's not just what you say as a professional, it's what you do in every context of your life. So that it really struck me, though, the sort of civil war element and nature of what's going on with the Bar Standards Board here. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are, Jan.
Yeah, well, we had a really fantastic event a couple of weeks ago where we brought together a panel of barristers who are very worried about these proposals. And luckily, we actually had somebody from the Bar Standards Board who is responsible for developing those proposals, who very kindly came and bravely actually came and joined our panel, and did her best to defend the proposals, but was also, as you said, kind of in listening mode. And I hope they're going to struggle to put these things through, really, because from what one of the very, very senior barristers who was on our panel said to me, was that he hasn't found anybody who supports them. So somehow this has kind of come in bureaucratically as a proposal, but it isn't something that is being a kind of bottom-up pressure from within the profession at all. And he said, as he described it, even the wokest of the barristers don't support this. And the thing that where the real kind of the sharp end of the wedge comes in on this, which is the cab rank rule, by which barristers operate, which is that they have to take up whichever case comes to them. They can't pick and choose their cases, and that's really, really important, especially as criminal barristers. You're taking on the hardest criminal cases of the most heinous people, who nevertheless require justice. So they're very aware that that's their primary duty, which is to deal without fear or favour with whoever comes up next on the list, and they pick up that case and act for them. And that's very different to the solicitors. That doesn't apply to them. So I think think I would encourage any professional to watch our video, which is up on our website and on our YouTube channel, because I think what they'll see is barristers putting forward really, really solid arguments against these proposals, which will have application for other professions which are not quite at the hard line that the barristers are, which is, if they are, which of having mixed obligations, which on the one hand to pick up any case, and on the other hand to somehow fulfill these other obligations, which are towards equality, diversity, and inclusion. So that it's really good. It's very well explained in the event. So I'd encourage people to go and watch that. But I'm really encouraging lots of other professionals like doctors and therapists and other people for whom there's similar things going on within their professions to really understand the seriousness of the kind of consequences of these proposals. But it's definitely worth a watch.
It does strike me as absurd, Jan, as well, that the bread and butter of, say, criminal courts is criminals. They're not the most savoury members of society. They've done some absolutely dreadful things, and yet the real hideous crimes of a serial killer, say, is not under threat here. Defending a serial killer is not under threat here, and yet, I would say a serial killer is a pretty nasty piece of work generally. But defending someone who is, for whatever reason, out of line with EDI suddenly becomes an issue. There's an absurdity here when you think it through. And I find it really interesting what you just said about it. The struggle to find a barrister who actually agrees with this. So, but I'm a bear of little brains, so I may have missed something fundamental there. But certainly, I think it's extraordinarily worrying for our judiciary, for our legal system to be going down this route is very worrying. It's been the sort of last bastion of common sense, I think, in our culture. So we need to fight tooth and nail for this. And actually, the last thing I'd say on this is that the FSU, we also have on our website, as well as that video, we've got our draft response to the Bar Standards Board to encourage as many people to read that, and potentially, if they are barristers, to lean on that for their own submission if they find that helpful. You wanted to talk about an upcoming Golden Founders Convention, didn't you?
Yes, so it's on Tuesday night. So this podcast goes out on Tuesday lunchtime, I think. So
it does, yeah.
Yeah, Tuesday night this week we've got our annual convention, which is for Gold and Founder members. Now we have to do this online because our Gold and Founder members are dispersed not just around the UK but also internationally. So to try to get input from as many people as possible, we do it online, which I know is not very satisfying for people, including me. I'd much rather be in a room with some wine afterwards.
A glass of wine.
Or before, in fact. But nevertheless, so you, Tom, and Toby will make yourselves available for an online meeting tomorrow night for Gold and Founder members. They've had an email in the last week, which and another one before that, which gives them the link so they can register to join that event. If they haven't received that, then if they email events@freespeechunion.org, and provided they are actually a Gold or Founder member, we can provide them with a link to join. So this is part of the kind of, because Gold and Founder members, Founder members were involved at the very, very beginning of the Free Speech Union when we launched it back in early 2020, and then Gold members pay, I think, £250 a year, so they give a lot of additional support. So as a kind of sign of our appreciation, we like to give them a certain kind of extras, if you like, but this is also something that's really helpful for us, I think, to hear what people think. A smaller number of people who are the most engaged. So you'll be presenting, won't you, tomorrow night on
That's right.
Tonight, Tuesday night. Right. On where we've got to, which is obviously substantially different to where we were at the beginning of 2024.
Well, even from the mid of 2024 is astonishing.
No, I know. I mean, crazy year.
The fact we were 14,000 members, Jan, at the end of June, 14,000. I think we've just ticked past 22,000. That's over a 50% increase.
Yeah.
It's been the most astonishing year. In many ways, all the stats, in many ways, been a bigger year than our founding year in 2020.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, we've called ourselves in the very beginning a mass membership organisation, and now we really are. A mass membership. Be careful what you wish for. No, it's brilliant. I mean, I woke up the other morning and just thought, we're like the underwear. We're kind of like the sort of foundation garments that make it possible for every other campaign and to exist, really, because there's so many people across loads of different campaigns who know that because they're a member of the Free Speech Union, they feel protected to go and pursue the causes that they want to pursue. So I kind of, I don't know, belt and braces, foundational undergarments, I don't know, we're
I was going
something
to say
like that.
not a pair
Armour,
of pants. I mean,
not a pair of
I
pants,
would
no,
say we are the armour.
sports bra.
If you're going to go to medieval England, I would say we're the armour, and then everyone can pick up their lance and their shield, get on their horse, and go into
Yeah,
battle. But yeah,
I know.
not a pair of pants, I think.
No, I think if I was Ben, I probably would know the precise terminology for the layer underneath the armour that actually provides
That's a
the protection against the
chainmail. I mean,
arrows. But
yeah, something
unfortunately,
like
I'm
that.
not.
Yeah, exactly. And finally, we have an interesting free speech row that's broken out this week, which relates to the Advertising Standards Authority. A comedian's advert was banned for mocking the Virgin Mary. It depicted the Scottish comic, who's called Fern Brady, as the Virgin Mary squirting breast milk into the mouth of a kneeling priest alongside the tour's title, I Gave You Milk to Drink. And the ASA launched an investigation after the advert was placed onto the Sky News website. Now, this is old-fashioned, isn't it? Old-fashioned clamping down on censorship on free speech. To me, when I read this, Jan, it takes me straight back to, not that I was an adult at the time, but it takes me straight back to The Life of Brian and the debate that happened back in, was it the 70s, I think, when that film came out?
1979. I looked it up this morning, actually.
Oh,
Funnily enough.
you had the same reference. I love
Yeah.
it. But it's almost exactly the same debate about the mocking religion and mocking sacred beliefs in a society, and whether or not one should be able to, and where the line goes. So, what are your thoughts on this, Jan?
Yeah, well, I also straight away thought of Life of Brian, which I absolutely love, and completely timeless and utterly brilliant.
Genius.
So that was 1979. And the Life of Brian was banned or had an 18 certificate given to it, X-rated, in 39 local authorities in the UK. And Ireland and Norway completely banned it. I mean, it is extraordinary, really. Now, when we watch it, it's become such a reference point, particularly the Loretta sketch.
Yeah.
I want the right to have a baby, but you haven't got a uterus. So, I do think that this is, and it's kind of interesting looking at the comments underneath the Times article, which I always find really helpful because you get quite a range of opinions. So there's people that straight away recognise this for old-fashioned censorship and this is ridiculous. Other people saying, well, this is or try that with Islam. They say try that with Islam, that's really a sort of not really a very helpful response, because actually you need to stand against this kind of censorship as much as you would against any kind of new blasphemy laws that are or blasphemy threats that might come in. So well, yes, it's true, it's kind of atypical in some ways because we are used to Christianity being mocked in all kinds of ways
now, can't it?
Yeah. But obviously I assume that we could also get to a place where bodies like the ASA become so risk averse that they also then go back to what they used to do around all faiths. So yeah, I mean, it's somebody raised the point, which is this is based on a 17th century painting of St. Bernard and the Virgin. So the actual theme of the Virgin miraculously providing breast milk, which saves the life of St. Bernard, is there depicted in a rather beautiful painting. As people saying, well, is the original painting also offensive? Then should that also be banned? So yeah, you can always get these quite good points being made when you look at how people respond.
But it really highlights the direction of travel, I think, doesn't it? That both you and I thought, goodness me, we're back having a debate that we had in the 70s. We're back looking at that kind of censorship, and we're stood in 2024 having that debate. I mean, we talk about progress, we talk about things going in one direction. I've always been a believer in the cyclical nature of so many things in life. Things get better, then they get worse, then they get better, then they get worse. But to me, this really highlights the direction of travel in our cultural thinking. And that idea of I'm all for free speech unless it tramples on people's sacred beliefs. And that idea of sacred belief, of course, Christianity, Islam, but also wokery, transgenderism, all of these other things that we talked about throughout the rest of this episode, they all fall into this sacralization of beliefs, which Eric Kaufmann has put into his book. And he said, this is why I'm pessimistic, Professor Eric Kaufmann, why I'm pessimistic about our fight at this stage against wokery, because actually it's become a sacred belief, and it's really hard to fight against a sacred belief as opposed to just a doctrine or a political dogma. So I thought, wow, it really is sort of shines a light on where we are at.
Although it's so flimsy. It's so flimsy, which is why it requires enforcement. I mean, otherwise, the belief itself would be so kind of commonly held and genuinely held by people that we would police ourselves around it. Whereas actually, it's this kind of much more authoritarian response that's needed because the beliefs themselves are so flimsy and inconsistent.
Yeah, which is that's a whole podcast episode in itself, I think, Jan. That idea, we'll have to hold that one over. But thank you to all of our listeners. Thank you to all of our viewers. Another great episode, and I think Jan and I, we're really getting good conversations going, Jan. So, Ben, who remembers Ben?
He's down in the trench. He really is down in the trenches.
He really
poor
is.
thing.
Yeah, he's
amongst the filing cabinets and dealing with the absolute front line of our casework. So
yeah,
all power to him.
Absolutely. But we wish everyone a good week. But bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.